Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is psychoactive drugs, and my guest is the legendary Dennis McKenna. He is the founding board member of the Hefter Research Institute. He is the director and president of the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy. With his brother Terence McKenna, he is author of, or co-author of, The Invisible Landscape, Mind, Hallucinogens, and the I Ching. They also co-authored under pen names the book Psilocybin, The Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide. Since Terence's unfortunate death many years ago, I believe it was the year 2000, Dennis has written Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, My Life with Terence McKenna, and more recently, he has edited a 2-volume ethnopharmacologic search for psychoactive drugs, which is the record of 2 conferences held 50 years apart in 1967 and in the year 2017. Dennis is located in British Columbia. And now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Dennis. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Very much a pleasure to be here, Jeffrey. Thank you for asking me.
It's a special experience for me, having many years ago conducted several interviews with your brother, Terence. They're among the most popular interviews we've ever released. But I know you've always been in the background of his story. And as I read over your book, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, I can see that many times you were in the foreground.
In some ways. I mean, I was in the background by preference, but yes. Terence had a silver tongue, and he was an excellent, conversationalist and deeply steeped in philosophy and, widely read. I'm not nearly as erudite as he is, but, and his talks have enormous longevity. I imagine those talks were like in the late 80s, early 90s that you did with him, and people are still listening to them. I mean, he's amazing. He's achieved, he's achieved this strange virtual form of immortality. His work is all over the YouTube, all over the net. He has more followers on Twitter than I do. I mean, and he's been dead for 22 years. Not bad. That's a slight exaggeration. But anyway, he's still very, very timely. And I think in part it's because his talks were so out of time. They were so ahead of their time in some ways. And so, yeah, it's a high bar, Jeffrey, but we'll do our best here.
I am delighted to have this time with you. I know your recent book, the ethnopharmacologic view of psychoactive drugs, was based on a couple of conferences, one back in 1967, one in 2017. And I think it's worth mentioning that I had the opportunity to meet you in person just a few months ago in 2022 at yet another conference on the impact of drugs. And that conference was of special interest to me because it related to the idea that the spirit entities that people seem to be in communication with under the influence of DMT in particular might be real.
That was a fascinating conference. And when this topic comes up about these sentient entities, whatever they may be, of course, immediately the question becomes, are they real? And then the question becomes, what do you mean by real? I mean, I sort of start from the premise that anything you experience is real. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily outside your head, or that it's I mean, if you get into these conversations about inside and outside, and real and not real, one thing that psychedelic experiences teach you, I think, is that these are very fluid concepts. I mean, you take psychedelics, and often one of the take-home lessons, one of the major ones, is that everything is connected. We are all one. That kind of thing. Interestingly, earlier today, I was just reading my news feed, and there was a talk. There was an article. I think it was in. Now I don't remember what it was in. I think it was in like The Futurist or something, about sort of the new emerging paradigm in cosmology. And this, as the big challenge in physics is to reconcile general relativity and quantum mechanics. And, there's a lot of theories about string theory and all this stuff, which I read about. I do not pretend to understand it all, but there's this new paradigm coming out around quantum entanglement, and the idea that there really is no multiplicity of reality. It is all one. It is all one. And everything that we experience is this fragmentary apprehension of what is actually just one thing, and it's kind of like, this is what the mind does in order to make the universe comprehensible to us, but entirely a construction of our minds, which in another context, I've been arguing for this for years, that we live in this reality hallucination, I like to call it. Now the neuroscientists, they call it the default mode network. But it's the same kind of idea that, we don't live in reality itself. We live in this model of reality that our brains construct in order to make it comprehensible, because of, and a lot of what that hallucination is, or that construct is, it's composed of filters. It's basically defined by what it doesn't allow in. And there's neural gating. I mean, the term in neuroscience is neural gating. Not a lot gets through. Enough gets through that we can construct this reality that we inhabit, that we call consensus reality. And part of the fascination and probably the therapeutic utility of psychedelics is that they temporarily disable that thing. They blow it up. They blow up this default mode network. And like a computer system, I think it's very similar to rebooting your computer, because it will fall back together. It is, the systems tend toward equilibrium. And even though you've blown it up completely and you're in this place where you're not really in these boundaries anymore, but it will come back together. If it doesn't, then you got a problem. And that rarely happens. It usually comes back together, and it usually works better afterwards. Just like, my Mac gets all messed up and I restart it, and suddenly it runs smoothly for a while until it decides not to. And I think that, that ability to sort of disrupt this default mode network is at the root of a lot of the therapeutic uses of psychedelics. That's one reason why the psychedelics can be thought of as in a way, a broad spectrum psychotherapeutic. They have applications to so many different kinds of disorders, from anxiety and depression to trauma and addiction and all of these things. But it's because it opens up an opportunity to sort of restructure your default mode network. And that's the common basis, like a broad spectrum antibiotic.
I know from reading your autobiography that before you even began to take a serious scientific interest in psychedelics, even as a high school student, you were widely imbibing LSD and other drugs. I didn't start out that early. I started out in college, but I can say I took over 100 instances of psychedelic use, and I think they were very beneficial for me. But what I really want to get at here, Dennis, is that in your book you talk about an important turning point in your life. You refer to it as the experience that took place at La Chorrera in Colombia. And I think it would be very enlightening for our viewers to probe that experience more deeply with you.
Right. Well, the experiment at La Chorrera is it's part of the Denny and Terence mythopoetic story, and you went right to it, Jeffrey. That's the one thing I hate to talk about, because for one thing, I've talked about it a lot, and for another thing, it's hard for me to even make any sense of it, that this is like 50 years later. In some ways, yeah, we went to La Chorrera in 1971, and the reason that we went there is because we were both taking psychedelics. Terence was in Berkeley, I was in Boulder, but we were exchanging, regular correspondence. They didn't have text or email in those days, of course, but we had this shared fascination with DMT. And we thought that DMT was really an order of magnitude stranger than and more interesting than LSD or other psychedelics. And back in those days, what there basically was LSD. Occasionally you could get, mescaline or peyote. DMT was a rare creature, almost a unicorn level creature at that time. There wasn't much of it. But Terence was very good at working the matrix, and he had it, and we had experienced it, and we thought, this is like the ultimate metaphysical reality, in some ways. This is just much stranger than LSD or any psychedelic. And we sort of came to it from the standpoint of science fiction in some ways. We were both heavily influenced by science fiction. And we were, so these DMT experiences seem to us like visits to literally another place, another dimension. We framed it in those terms rather than like they weren't spiritual. We didn't view it that way. They weren't like participating in ethnomedical traditions or anything like that. We had this idea that it let you penetrate to another place, and where that was in space or time was a question. But anyway,
I noticed in your book there was a very brief mention right before the section on the La Chorrera experience. You mentioned in passing the idea of being in contact with mantid-like beings in a UFO. And I wonder if there's any more to that.
Well, I think that was just one of the tropes that sort of was part of this idea of the encounter that we had. We in this encounter with the mushrooms over, 10 days or so that led up to this experiment, we had the idea, we even called it the teacher, and I think that we thought the teacher was channeling through the mushrooms. It wasn't the mushrooms, it was the teacher. And the teacher yeah, sort of had this mantid-like character and so on. So that was it. Uh, Lately, thinking back on the conference that Anton organized, I am reading currently this book called The Falling Sky. Have you read that?
No, I haven't.
Relevant to the idea of the DMT entities,
Mm.
because the question that we started out with, is this real?
Yeah.
Well, this is written by Bruce Albert, who's an anthropologist, but he's basically translating the words of a Yanomami shaman, Davi Kapanawa, I think, and it's. I mean, you talk about the DMT entities. For him, they are totally real, and not only, and they get to it through the snuff. I mean, the snuff is understood to be the food of these spirits, which he calls the Zapiri. And the shamans form essentially these symbiotic relationships with the Zapiri through the use of this snuff. And then through the Zapiri, there's a whole other dimension of other kinds of spirits, some ancestral, some animal, and so on. Just an absolutely fascinating book, and for not everybody in the tribe, but for the shamans in the tribe, the experience of these Zapiri is completely a real thing, an everyday reality. And because they're so influential, shamans are, I mean, many of the men in the tribe, take this snuff and share this reality. I highly recommend it. It's really, really very interesting. And for me, it sort of answers the question, one of the questions anyway, that came up in the conference. One of the things I was wondering is, and I think I asked in our talk of, it doesn't matter if the spirits are real or not. What matters is the information. Is the information useful or valid? And reading this book shows that, at least in this culture, for these people, the information is valid. It's what they view, their whole worldview is seen through this lens. And, the Zapiri world is as real as the Amazonian environment that they inhabit. So, highly recommended. It's a long read. It's not an easy read, but it's worth it if you're interested.
Very good. I'll take a look at it.
So it was this fascination with DMT that led us to go to South America in search of this orally active form of DMT. And the reason we were interested in that is because one thing about DMT, many things about DMT, but one thing about it, when you smoke it, which is how it has to be taken, because it's not orally active, they smoke the free base, literally in a crack pipe. You get an overwhelming, astonishing experience, but it only lasts about 20 minutes, and by the time you're there and sort of wondering, what the hell is going on, you're already on the way down, and so you don't have any time to spend in this dimension that we thought of it. So we heard about this paper that Schultes had published, famous R.E. Schultes, in the Botanical Museum leaflet. And we were thinking if you could find an orally active form of DMT, it would last longer. It was simply that naive that it would last longer, and we could spend more time there, and we could sort of look around and see what was going on. Because by the time you you get deep into that space, it's already fading, by the time you've overcome your initial astonishment. And so we thought, well, yeah, we have to go investigate this thing. And this was 1970. And 1971, we went there. But a couple of, we'd heard about it about a year before that. And we decided, and at the time, the pharmacology of ayahuasca was not really understood. The importance of the admixture plants, and because ayahuasca is effectively an orally active form of DMT, right? It's potentiated by the beta carbolines, the monoamine oxidase inhibitors in the vine, one of the components, and that enables DMT to become orally active. We didn't know that. Nobody knew that at that time. There were people speculating, but it was not clear. But then this article by Schultes came along, and it was like Verola as an orally active hallucinogen. And for us, it may as well have been written in neon flashing letters, with aha, this is it. This is the secret, and we have to go after this thing. So we went to La Chorrera. It was an obscure drug that was used by the Witoto people. And it was Verola, made from Verola, which is a tree widely used in the Amazon basin in the preparation of snuffs. The sap of the tree is very high in DMT and often 5-methoxy-DMT in combination. So they prepare a snuff from this sap, and they powder that down, and they use it that way. And we may circle back on this because there's been interesting new information about these snuffs based on this book I've been reading. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. So this was different because it was orally active, right? The other tribes used the snuff. The Witoto used this orally active paste that they make into little pills, and they take it that way. And it was said to be very rapid and very reality disrupting, and way to get in touch with the little people, as they called them. And of course, Terence, at least, was very interested in the little people because of the whole machine elf thing, which I don't think everybody sees. But so we determined to go to South America, La Chorrera, the ancestral home of the Witotos, to look for this drug. Well, when we got to La Chorrera, we had been cautioned on the way in. We had met an anthropologist on the way in who was studying the Witoto. We knew he was there. I mean, we talked to his colleagues in Bogota. We knew at some point our paths would cross, and they did. And he was there. And he was at the village downriver from La Chorrera at that time. And he was appalled, when we showed up. I mean, you can't exactly send a text and say we're on the way. So these, we were far more colorful than any of the Witoto people. We were full hippie mode, long beards, bells, beads, the whole thing, and it's like, who the hell are these people? And if it wasn't bad enough, then we said, well, hey, Doc, we're here to find ukuhe. What can you tell us about it? That really got him off. And he said, you can't just go start talking to these people about ukuhe. This is like, their biggest shamanic secret, they'll probably kill you if you even mention it. Well, he was a little bit, he overstated it a little bit, but we said, yeah, okay, we'll be careful. And we went on from that village, and we went a 4-day trek to La Chorrera overland, which was on a parallel river, the Garaparaná. When we ended up at La Chorrera, finally, it was a pretty rough slog, even though it was only 4 or 5 days. But, we were hardly experienced jungle travelers. But when we showed up at La Chorrera, we thought, well, we'll just hang out and try to make contact discreetly and gently with the local folks and asked them about ukuhe. But what we found was that about 200 acres around this mission village, it was a Capuchin mission, La Chorrera, they'd cleared the forest and they brought in these Cebu cattle and the white humpback cattle. And it was the rainy season. So out of every cow pie were growing huge clusters of Psilocybe cubensis, beautiful specimens of Psilocybe cubensis, the pan-tropical psilocybin mushroom. And we knew what they were. We had very little experience with them. In fact, only one very sort of cursory encounter, which we had at one of our stops on the way at another town on the Putumayo on our way to La Chorrera, and we found one or two, but it was dry and we didn't find any specimens, so it wasn't much of an encounter. And so when we got to La Chorrera, we thought, oh, this is great. We can just experience these. We can play around with these until the real secret shows up. And we did think of this ukuhe as the secret. We sort of created this whole myth around the idea. Well, and so we started eating the mushrooms on a very casual basis, not really with the respect or the clarity that we should have. Well, the mushrooms sort of quickly corrected that. We started eating them, and they made it clear that they were the real secret, and they were what we had come for. They were the source of the knowledge that we were seeking. And so that's what got us sucked into the experiment at La Chorrera. It started, sort of laying out the framework for an experiment, which was an experiment only in the loosest sense. It wasn't an experiment. We thought of it that way, but not really. It should be called the ritual at La Chorrera. But anyway, it was like a telepathic download of gnosis about what we could do with these mushrooms if we could use them and to imitate a sound inside our heads. And when you imitated this sound, there was a whole elaborate thing about the molecular resonances that this would set up and affect the binding of the molecules into the neurons, and would create a standing waveform, which would be a reflection of basically some kind of instantiation of the Akashic records, that was locked into our DNA, that was locked, in fact, into the DNA of all species. And we would have access to this. And it was an experiment that would result in the creation of an artifact that would be a fusion of matter and mind. You would be able to see it and be it at the same time. And you could control it with your thought, right? And so this is what we set out to create with the experiment at La Chorrera. Now, I have to say, 50 years on, or more than 50 years on now, this was bunk, this was just a serious delusion. There's no scientific validity to this. But we were utterly convinced that, we were getting this gnosis, and if we did what it said, we could create this object, and that would change everything. It would essentially bring history to an end. And that didn't happen. We're still here, But what did happen is that we had a what you might call a simultaneous break with reality. With, in psychology, as you know, there's a phenomenon called the folie à deux, the folly of two. And my brother and I experienced that in like complementary ways. We experienced about a 2-week extended alter state in which I basically disengaged from reality completely. And my brother became hypervigilant and totally focused on reality, and focused especially on me, because I think, he was concerned about looking after me. He didn't sleep for 2 weeks. And I didn't sleep. I don't know if I slept or not. I was not concerned with those sorts of things. I was cruising literally through the cosmos. I experienced this state of mind where I thought I had blown up my consciousness to be co-continuous with the edges of the universe. I was talk about being all one. I was all one with the galaxies, with the universe. And then slowly over this 2 weeks, I began to collapse back, and each 24 hours was another step in this process. So that, first it was the universe, and then it was the supercluster, then the local cluster, then the galaxy, and so on. Eventually, I condensed back into my body and my mind, and I mean, severely shaken, obviously, but in reflecting back on this, I have thought, and I'm even given talks called Experiment at La Chorrera. Is it a psychotic break? Was it a shamanic initiation, or was it an alien encounter? And I think there are elements of all of those things in what happened to us, and it was an inflection point, certainly in our lives. It's like I was 20 when this happened. Terence was 24. So we were just astonishingly young when these things went down, and we were at that place where young men, well, probably young women too, but young men often get to a place where they think they know everything and they actually know nothing, but they don't know that they know nothing. And so, this was a very impactful experience, and it kind of colored the rest of our lives. My reaction to this, after we did more or less get stuck back together and could operate in what people call consensus reality, my reaction to that, the process of integration, was I wanted nothing to do with it in some ways. I was happy to get my feet back on the ground. And I sort of said, well, I'm going to go back to school and I'm going to start studying hard science, because we'd had this conversation about, Terence was like, science will never explain this, and I was saying, well, we're not scientists yet. We may have thought we were scientists, but we're not scientists. So we have to be able to do science before we can reject science. And so I said, I'm going to go back and study science. And that's what I did. And then that sort of was the beginning of my career in ethnobotany, ethnopharmacology, neuroscience, and all that. Terence went a different direction. I mean, he was more convinced at the time that we really had done something, that we had succeeded. What we had predicted didn't happen. But out of his ideations during this period, what came out initially was sort of the kernel of his ideas about time, that eventually he developed over decades into this idea of time wave zero, which he claimed was, it was based on the I Ching, the mathematical sequence of the I Ching. He claimed that it was a map of the ingression of novelty into space-time, into existence, related very clearly to the philosophies of Whitehead, although we discovered Whitehead some years later, a couple of years later, in our efforts to sort all this stuff out. And he constructed this very elaborate idea about the time wave, and that this described the texture of time and the ingression of novelty, and very much a sort of, I think, a reflection of the fact that we were both Catholic. We grew up Catholic, and there was this Catholicism and Christianity in general is basically an apocalyptic religion. I mean, built into the idea is there's going to be an end to time. And, time will end, and then it will be the last judgment or whatever. And this was, probably... So the time wave for Terence became like a years-long effort to nail down, when is it going to end? Where do you put the end date of this time wave? And, eventually he settled on December 21st, 2012 as the end date for various reasons, not least that was a major point in the Aztec calendar and the Mayan calendar, the end of the 13th Baktun, which was misinterpreted as being the end of the whole thing. It's not really, but it was the end of a big cycle. And of course, so it became that, if the singularity is going to happen, it's going to all collapse. It's a spiral, right? It's a fractal thing. And these cycles are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And finally, we'll reach a point where they're nanoseconds. And at that point, the singularity is going to collapse. And it'll all go away, Well, obviously that didn't happen, and Terence never lived to see that, the theory was invalidated. But a lot of people took this time wave thing very seriously. I was always a skeptic, but a lot of people did take it seriously. And I think it's an interesting mathematical construct based on the I Ching. One thing it is for sure, at least you can interpret it this way, it's a 13-month lunar calendar, which might be a way of looking at the I Ching that nobody had really thought of. And if he had written about it in that respect, a few sinologists would have taken note and nobody else would have noticed. But no, he made a career out of it. And in part, we argued a lot about the time wave, and I was saying, the problem with the time wave, there's two problems. Well, there's many problems with it, but two major problems that I see with the time wave is you, Terence, you're the only one that can actually interpret it. It's a reflection of your understanding of history. That's a big problem. And the second major problem is you haven't defined any way to disprove it. You're not interested in disproving it, but if you want to call it theory, you have to define what will invalidate it. And I'm coming at that now for kind of from my my scientific bias, understanding of what science is, which I had acquired after coming back and actually became a scientist. Half of my undergraduate study was philosophy of science. A lot of Whitehead and other people. But one thing about science, one thing that's beautiful about science is you construct models, you construct hypotheses about phenomena, something, understanding of something, and then you really try hard to demolish that, to say, what does it not explain? What is missing here? How does it need to be modified? Or maybe you just trash it and start over. And Terence wasn't interested, nor could he say what would invalidate it. So I've been talking a lot here.
Oh, okay. It's a wonderful story, actually. There's so many directions we could go. I know I first learned about the time wave theory from another student of psychedelics, Jean Houston, who was something of a mentor of mine, and she was enthusiastic about it. And one of the points she made was that in our present era, we are something of a recapitulation of what happened to ancient Rome. You could say a fractal pattern of the Roman Empire, and we could understand our present era by thinking about the issues that the ancient Romans faced.
Right. Yeah, that was the whole idea about the construction of the time wave, was that there are these many cycles that were nested. It was really a fractal thing. And the idea was that different eras in history resonate with each other in terms of, so the 4,800 year cycle reflects the shorter, I forget what the exact spans were, but you could see these same patterns in these different cycles. And it's a fascinating idea. But the problem is the only person defining those correspondences was Terence. In some ways, the time wave tells you more about Terence's understanding of history than it does about time. It doesn't describe time. It describes his understanding of history, which was not trivial. He was very widespread. It was very complex. But it was about his own understanding of history. And we used to, have, I wouldn't call them arguments, but I call them lively discussions about what is novelty. It's supposed to describe novelty. And I'm down with that theory. I believe Whitehead was correct that, every day something happens that has never happened before in the history of the universe. There is truly novel events, but what is novelty and how do you know it when you see it? And Terence he was preoccupied, or he was saying, well, events like, the first detonation of the atomic bomb, or the first landing on the moon, or these incredibly significant historical events, those are novel events. And so he was like a proponent of the eruptive theory of novelty. It just happens. It just explodes into history. But look at all the precursors that lead to that. In the case of the atomic bomb, starting with, maybe Einstein's theory and understanding the physics of it and all the work that went before in developing nuclear reactions, understanding that. All of that was the groundwork that led eventually to the detonation of the first bomb, in Alamogordo, Mexico in the 40s. But so where's the novelty? And I was saying novelty doesn't erupt into history. Novelty leaks into history. And most of the truly novel events you don't even notice until they culminate in some kind of, incredibly attention-getting and novel, but definitely they have all these precursors that nobody pays attention to until you look back on it. You say, well, if Einstein hadn't had these understandings, if Fermi and Chicago Fieldhouse hadn't done the experiments that he'd done, all of these things, that's where the novelty is. And so we don't disagree, but because Terence, his looked at these events over vast spans of time and tried to make a supposition about where you place the end date, and there were many end dates that were postulated in the early days, and they kept getting, well, for one thing, more and more pushed out, which was comfortable in some ways because it means you're never going to reach that point. And in fact, that was true. I mean, he selected, December 21st, 2012 as the definitive end date that was going to either validate or invalidate the time wave. Well, of course, he didn't live to see that, and he had every expectation that he would, I'm sure, and it's a pity that he didn't in some ways. But it turned out to be kind of a non-event, and all the astronomical alignments and everything that the calendar talked about took place, and they were remarkable. But you could have, that's just built into celestial mechanics, and the Mayans were great astronomers, and they were able to, construct this calendrical system that diagrammed all those things. So.
Well, one of the points that you made in your book, and you seem to be hinting at the moment, is that sometimes the ideation that comes through the use of these various botanical psychoactive substances leads one into experiences that are delusions. You yourself described an instance in which you felt, I think it was mushrooms, led you into a paranoid state. You were with some friends and you thought they were about to murder you.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. That's right. Some people that I met when I was on a weekend vacation on the Big Island, and we went up to the place on the land where Terence and Kat eventually established Botanical Dimensions, and we took mushrooms, and I became utterly convinced at some point in the proceedings, not that it had done anything overt or anything, I just became convinced that these people were, cannibal sex killers, and that they were going to, they were going to off me. Nothing like that happened, and it was completely bunk. But I think that is, and maybe with mushrooms, they're a little more like this. Mushrooms are tricky. You can't always trust them. And and people do get into these delusional places, and I get emails all the time from people who have had revelatory experiences, revelatory insights, and they're utterly convinced that they are the Messiah or whatever, or that and I respond and I say, well, first of all, stop taking any substance. Get your head back together, get your feet on the ground, look at this 48 hours later or 2 weeks afterwards and see if it holds up. And I really think that's a good thing. I think the reality check is useful, because, especially, that mechanism would have saved us a lot of trouble at La Chorrera if we'd had that in place. But we were not interested in that. We were we were sucked down the rabbit hole or down the wormhole or whatever it was at that point. There was no stopping because, we were in communication with this apparently oracular intelligence, whether it was the mushroom or something talking through the mushrooms, but it was definitely a telepathic kind of encounter. And it was presenting all these just crazy ideas, which seemed quite acceptable. We didn't have a problem that, in order to carry out this experiment, we would have basically had to violate every law of physics known to science. That was the point, So, yeah, you have to be careful. That's why it's good to, go into these experiences, especially if you're looking for a therapeutic, outcome. You need to prepare carefully for it. You need to have a good guide or someone who does remain in reality to help you through it. And then the integration thing. And, I think that now that psychedelics are more popular and people are going to South America and taking ayahuasca, taking mushrooms and that sort of thing, I don't discourage that, but I think there's a danger of getting sort of into these mindsets about the psychedelics that aren't really true, because there's of course all the indigenous beliefs, and then that's often amalgamated with sort of idiosyncratic individual beliefs and new age, suppositions and all this. And I think the term is woo-woo. It's very possible to accept the woo-woo as just given, and people don't examine their premises very, very carefully, and I think they should. I think that just because you're taking psychedelics and having these experiences that do demolish your default mode network, which is usually what's keeping you on track and keeping you focused, that's the danger of it. Just because you're doing that, you don't have an excuse to let your skeptical antennas down. You should keep those antennas highly tuned and well functioning, and it can save you a lot of grief. I think. But then I'm saying this, and but I'm saying it 50 years or more on from this experience. So I guess I become just a boring old reductionist or something.
Or maybe a wise person. You've learned from some of the mistakes you've made, perhaps. Not that they were all mistakes. I think the idea of becoming one with the cosmos is a wonderful experience if one can learn how to return, and I gather it took you a long time to return. But Dennis, let's talk about your present activities. What's your main focus these days?
Some of the issues around our co-optation, if you will, of these sacred traditions, of these indigenous traditions. There's now a whole ayahuasca tourist industry, and, there are companies that are, have taken things like psilocybin and are moving forward on the very capitalist-driven kind of big pharma track. And I think there's a risk of forgetting the origins of these things, and really the fact that indigenous people have been the stewards of this knowledge and the stewards of the genetic resources and the habitats of these things for many thousands of years. And I think we're at risk of repeating that with the psychedelics, and I'm one of the guilty ones, in some ways. I don't think that I have thought as clearly about this as I have within the last few years, to think, who's really benefiting from this? And are the people that should benefit, should be certainly major stakeholders, at least, the indigenous communities, are they getting the benefit that they deserve? Or are we just repeating this legacy of biopiracy that started, well, really hundreds of years ago, certainly in the New World with the Columbian Exchange? I mean, most of the food and medicinal plants that are now global have been basically ripped off from indigenous communities with very little effort to repair that wrong, and I think, I think we have to re-understand it. I think that, I don't think it works to say, well, we should just leave that alone. We took it from these people, and we should not, because as a biologist, I think that these plants are in a co-evolutionary relationship with us. And I think that, in some ways you could say, well, these are the common heritage of humanity, and these medicines have the potential to heal millions of people potentially, and heal the species and heal the planet, in some ways, because the insights that you get from a lot of these, very often people have a re-understanding of how out of harmony we are with nature, how out of touch with nature we are, and with ourselves as a species. And, the psychedelics open a window onto that, onto those realizations. And we need to acknowledge that. We need to internalize that and say, we're going to act differently. We're going to work with, but I don't think it works to say, well, we made a mistake, we'll leave these things alone. In the first place, that's not going to happen, because a lot of this is driven by what's always driven these things, corporate greed and the desire to make a profit and all that. And there is great potential. What may be different this time than before, when we've taken plants or foods or medicines out of nature, these actually change the mind, and so the people funding these corporations and funding all this economic activity, they may take these things, and then it may be in their face that, hey, wait a minute, you need to re-understand what you're doing here and make a change. This is what I'm hoping. And so I'm, like I say, I'm evolving. It's not really my place to wag the finger at other people, because, like I say, I have been guilty of this. On the other hand, like when I organized retreats and invited people, obviously the very fact that they're going to retreats means that they're privileged, but I have also seen people come to these events with, and experience tremendous healing. Most people who go to these retreats, they, at least in my experience, they are not looking for thrills. They have serious spiritual or psychological issues that they're dealing with, and, for example, trauma and that sort of thing. And I've seen tremendous healing. So what we have to do is try and find a way that the indigenous people are represented, but we somehow can get this to the world in some ways. So there are a number of organizations that are doing this, and we're trying to align with them. I can just mention, in passing, two that are really doing very good work. One is ICERS, which stands for the International Center for Ethnobotanical Education and Research and Service. So icers.org, and also the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund. And they are also working very closely with ICERS, and the two organizations are going to, and they're looking at it from the standpoint of, like sort of different biocultural spheres. Like Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund is very active in trying to protect peyote, particularly because that's particularly threatened. But then these other things as well, like ayahuasca and the Sonoran Desert toad, and other things. Some are more impacted than others, but these people are doing good work, and I think there is a, So I look at the sort of like the social and the cultural context, but then as a biologist, I have to look at the 30,000-foot level too and think, this is coevolution, and coevolution is not pretty. Coevolution is sometimes pretty rough. Maybe this is one of the rough spots where we can get through it, and everyone can benefit, including the people that have been the keepers of this wisdom for so long.
Well, Dennis McKenna, this has been a very thought-provoking conversation. I'm very glad to be connected with you and to appreciate the depth of your experience from the educational point of view, the scientific point of view, and particularly from the experiential point of view. So it's an honor for me to be able to share your life experience with the New Thinking Aloud audience. I hope we can have future conversations.
Well, I would love to, Jeffrey. Yeah, there's obviously a lot more to say. Yeah. People can look at the McKenna Academy, and also I want to mention and plug for the this conference we did last May before the one you and I were at. And people should look at the ethnopharmacologic search for psychoactive drugs. Go to espd55.com. You can register. You can see everything that was presented there and get an idea, what we've been up to, and get some education about some of these issues. So that would be my final plug. Is it's open access. You just have to register with an email and a password, and you can look at everything. And for those that want to pursue it, that's a good place to start.
We will list all of the links in the description of this video, and in particular, the links to the McKenna Academy. So, Dennis, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's taken a while, but I'm glad we did this finally, and I'm looking forward to the next time.
And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us.